What we've seen at the end of the day is one Israeli for 3 Palestinian hostages.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed that Israel will fight until they achieve victory over Hamas.
The number one and number two priorities of this war for Israel was, one, to release the hostages, and two, to defeat Hamas.
We begin with the latest on the ceasefire in Gaza, which entered its 5th day today. The originally 4-day ceasefire was extended by 2 more days, with Hamas agreeing to release at least 10 hostages daily. So far, the ceasefire has held, with Hamas releasing at least 12 more hostages today. The U.S. CIA director is back tonight in the Gulf state of Qatar, which has served as the intermediary with Hamas as he pushes for a further extension of the ceasefire. We're joined now by Enia Krvine, senior director of the Foundation of Defense of Democracy's Israel program. Enia, welcome back to the show. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so it's been incredible to see these families reunited and hostages released, but there is concern that the pause is giving Hamas time to regroup. And not only that, but Hamas gets to dictate any additional pauses just by releasing 10 more hostages. Do you think that this gives Hamas the upper hand here?
It certainly is a gut-wrenching dilemma that Israel faces right now. I mean, the number one and number two priorities of this war for Israel was, one, to release the hostages, and two, to defeat Hamas, to destroy Hamas so that events like October 7th could never happen again. And as you can see from the beginning of the day, from day one of this war, those two priorities have been in constant tension. Right now, Israel has decided to agree to the pause negotiated by third parties, Qatar and the U.S., and it is having the successful hostage exchange, which has been incredibly powerful to watch as an observer. The pause went in the day after the pause in hostilities. The truce went in the day after Thanksgiving, and we've seen these hostages coming home. But there is no doubt that this is going to benefit Hamas. I mean, the resources and the fuel coming into Gaza now under the terms of the deal will directly benefit the terrorist group. And we know that Israel has lost some of its momentum by halting the war now. And that's why it was intensely debated within Israel of when it was the right time to do this deal. But at the end of the day, Israel values life above everything else. And to see these families reunited as these children and these women have come home has been extremely powerful.
Let me ask you about this, because also with this comes the release of prisoners. And when you look back, one of the masterminds of the October 7th attacks was Yahya Sinwar. And he was a prisoner released about 10 years ago in exchange for one IDF soldier. Do you think Israel is doing enough now to vet these Palestinian prisoners they're releasing in exchange for the hostages?
There's no doubt that Israel is releasing people back onto the street in Israel, these prisoners that are now being released in Israel and in the West Bank, some of them in East Jerusalem, which have full access to Israelis' towns and cities. There's no doubt that these people who are convicted and, have demonstrated a propensity towards violence, some of them will return to violence. And this is something that Israel's seen time and again. I mean, you cited the deal about 10 years ago when Gilad Shalit, and one Israeli soldier who had been held in Gaza for a handful of years, was exchanged for 1,000 prisoners, many of whom had blood on their hands, like Yahya Sinwar, who you mentioned, who was the mastermind of October 7th. So there is this history of Hamas trading Israelis who are held hostage for prisoners. It's part of the reason they do it. It's successful. It's popular among the Palestinian people, and Israel knows that it's a terrible deal. However, one thing that I will say is at the beginning, a couple days after October 7th, the initial demands of Hamas were 6,000 prisoners in exchange for the hostages. And Hamas were even talking about negotiating with Americans for terrorists held in American jails. And what we've seen at the end of the day is one Israeli for 3 Palestinian hostages. So, there's a lot of debate right now if it was the right thing to do and what the consequences will ultimately be. But getting these Israelis back in exchange for 3 Palestinians held seems like a decent deal, and it's certainly a far cry from the initial 6,000 that Hamas leadership were demanding in exchange.
It definitely helps put it in perspective to understand the background there. Let me ask you this before we let you go, because Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed that Israel will fight until they achieve victory over Hamas. But considering there could ultimately be up to 3 weeks of ceasefire if Hamas continues to release 10 hostages a day, does Israel risk looking like the instigator here in the fighting? How do they manage that optic on the world stage in the final 30 seconds, Enia?
Thank you. So I think that's why Bill Burns went over to Qatar today with Mossad Director David Barnea. I think this is the conversation they're having. They want one big deal. They want to try and get as many prisoners out as they can, as many hostages out as they can, as many hostages that are held in Gaza, so that this doesn't extend forever. The U.S. and Israel share the same goal, that is to destroy Hamas. And the longer this draws out, the more damaging it's going to be for Israel's goals towards destroying Hamas. But I will say one thing. For every hostage we see coming home, for all these women and children, there is a father left behind. The men and the soldiers who remain in Israel are somebody's fathers. There's somebody's son. There's women soldiers who we are not sure what their fate is. There are still Americans who are in Gaza. So, while we do see these hostages coming home, and it is this warm feeling of getting them back, there is still over 170 hostages that are unaccounted for. We've had no signs of life, and there is real reason for Israel to continue this campaign in order to achieve, the way we started this conversation, goals 1 and 2, to bring the hostages back and destroy Hamas. And I think Israel will have the resolve to continue it when this deal runs its course, whether it's 3 more days or 5 more days or whatever is ultimately negotiated. There will be a return to the war because Israel has not met its number 1 and number 2 priorities of this conflict.